Welcome to the Property Business Accelerator podcast. Today, with a general election coming up just under a month away on the 4th of July, I've got my co-host Toby Spanier here to discuss how the different parties and what's going on with the general election and property investing. I'm Mike Frisby and I'm also your co-host of the Property Business Accelerator. So Toby, big news, general election's been called, and now we have to think about what's going to happen to property investment, the property market. Obviously, quite often it stalls, no one wants to do anything. So first point of advice I'd say to everybody, there's some deals to be done between now and the election because lots of people don't like making offers until they know the outcome of the election. But putting that aside, how do you think each different party is going to influence the property market?
So I think for existing property people, existing landlords, the big question is around banning Section 21 evictions, the so-called no-fault eviction, but really just no reason given eviction. And it's a bit of a shame that the legislation, which wasn't perfect, but was ready to go, has just been, chucked. And is even more sort of galling that Labour were happy for the existing place that we got to be part of wash-up. And wash-up is the bit that basically allows legislation to happen before we kind of go into this sort of recess period. Yeah. So Labour weren't totally happy with all the arrangements. They're happy enough to make this law. So it's even more galling that, this has been going on for 5 years. It's now just been chucked away. So what it means is that whoever gets in power on the 4th of July is going to have to come back to this topic, and they're going to have to come back to this topic, but they've got a clean sheet and they've got 5 years. So if it's Labour, they can really overthink it. And I think the danger there is that we end up with something which is not as cognizant of the broader picture of how the rental market works. It might look really great for renters, but it might sort of miss a few of the nuances. Where I think we got to was, not everyone was happy with it. I thought the NRLA did a good job of making sure some of the silliness of the original proposals were kind of dealt with, that they'd actually thought through how this thing would operate. And there was something that was, not ideal, but it was workable. If the Conservatives get in, I think they'll still take the opportunity to rethink it and not just say, oh, this is where we got to, let's continue it. I think they've got 5 years to work on it. So they'll make tweaks. I think Labour will go in with a harsher, more sort of what appears to be a more tenant-friendly approach. But as we all know, politics is like a deflated balloon. And if you squeeze it in one place, the air is still in the system.
Absolutely.
It just pops out somewhere else. And you constantly get the law of unintended consequences with tinkering around the edges without stepping back and looking at the whole system. So I think all the things that have been done to date, legislation over the last 5 years, to be more tenant-friendly, have won a lot of praise at the time, got a lot of headlines, but ultimately tenants have not been served by these changes. They've actually just forced up the price of renting, made it more difficult to rent, given them less choice. It hasn't really achieved what it said on the tin.
Yeah, I think this is the thing. This election is a big election, really, because renters are now, previously I feel homeowners were a core part of what the policies were about, whereas now, as there's such a big rental, vote winners, and they're the switchers. Quite often, there's a large portion of voters who are the switchers, as Labour's trying to attract in, Conservatives want to appeal to, and therefore renter-friendly legislation is now part of it. And I guess this rhetoric around no-fault evictions, as everyone calls it, when in reality, not many landlords actually evict people for no fault. There is a reason why they're doing it.
There's always a reason.
It's just an easy process to follow than something else, which is what the concerns are of the landlords. So yes, I'm worried about where Labour is going to go with some of these reforms. And also, the other big buzzword, I guess, in the Labour Party would be rent caps. Now, rent caps to me are quite concerning, not because I just think, it's again, as you were saying, what is the consequence of these things? So it's a vote winner. it kind of could make sense to stop housing going up. Obviously, landlords will be a bit annoyed with it. But what are the consequences of these rent caps? What is that, as you say, you squeeze the balloon, other things pop out elsewhere. And I think you're spot on that these are my worries, is that they don't look at the holistic picture, and all of these the things happen. And under Section 24, when they put it couldn't offset your interest anymore, rents have gone up, there's a shortage of rental stock, and actually the tenants are paying. And so now they're using another bludgeon, which is potentially rent controls. And in Scotland, rent controls haven't worked.
It's a disaster anywhere in Europe and anywhere worldwide you look at it. And you can't find an economist, a respected economist, who thinks rent controls is a good idea and ultimately serves the long-term interest of tenants. But remember, the system's a deflated balloon. So if there's tinkering one part, it just means that another part is affected. And as landlords, we will just go to the parts where we can make the business work best. So if there's a distortion in one part, it's just going to drive up rent. So what happens with rent control? You can't put up the rents more than the rate of inflation each year. But as soon as that tenant leaves, and it does happen, that's when you return the rent to the market rate, or what should be the market rate. So what we're going to see is rents jump up by a huge amount whenever tenants leave. And eventually tenants do leave because their circumstances change. And that will make it more unaffordable for tenants. That will make there to be less supply. That will make more demand for new tenancies, which is going to drive up the price of rent. So again, it's a deflated balloon. You can't change one part of the system without realising it's just going to affect another part of the system. What you really need to do is look at the whole system and work out what can we do that's actually going to affect the outcome that you want of more choice, more housing for renters at more affordable prices. That's a different route to go down. And neither party's really got the answer to that, because it's really about increasing supply, which is not an easy thing to do. And it's not an easy thing to do within a 5-year term. A lot of these problems are things that can only be fixed over a decade or more.
Yeah.
And so politicians grab at the headlines. They do things that look like they are friendly to tenants, but actually end up.
I think that's a broader discussion, isn't it? Because policy can, it's kind of on a 5-year cycle, and some of these things are so ingrained and enrooted and need a long-term solution, a sea change, generational change, especially with the supply of property. So we'll come back to talk about what, if there's any differences on the government's, the parties on what they're trying to do to increase supply, because I don't think any government is really doing enough. I mean, they all talk about planning as being the golden, the goal, that's where the whole thing is going to make a big impact quickly, which is not right. But I come back to the rental reform bill and, capped rents. For me, again, it's actually the most vulnerable of society that are going to suffer in this, because they're going to struggle to get properties because, again, if you can't evict tenants, you can't put up rents, you're going to want the best tenants. And it's the vulnerable ones and the ones that don't have the best credit rating, maybe on benefits, maybe on this. They just going to struggle because there's going to be limited supply.
Yeah.
Stock, there's no incentive for a landlord to have the best property anymore because, you don't make more money. You can't charge a higher rent. So properties start to decrease, in my view, in quality, because you can't differentiate yourself versus the market in that sense and charge the premium for it. Everybody comes in the same class. It's like having a flight that's all one class in the...
let's just look at the Section 21 banning policy, which has taken 5 years to get absolutely nowhere. That's where we've got to. We've got nowhere.
Yeah.
But because of all the uncertainty that's been created, a lot of landlords who weren't going to evict tenants thought, if I don't evict them now, I'll never be able to evict them. So it's driven a much higher level of eviction. So the government wants to prevent eviction and comes up with a policy that actually increases it. That is what I mean by this deflated balloon. If you squeeze it somewhere, it pops out somewhere else. The other thing I would say about Section 21 is the advantage to landlords is that there's no reason given. It's not a no fault. There's definitely reasons, but no reason is given. And because no reason is given, it's just the landlord says, I want to take the property back, then there can be no counter-argument to the landlord of, I don't agree with your reason, because there is no reason. And because there's no reason, then the thing doesn't need to go to court. Remember, our courts are completely clogged up with much more important cases than, evictions. So what's good about the Section 21 process is it gives a property back to a landlord. And there's a reason that the landlord wants it back. No one does these things without a good reason to do them. Otherwise, because as landlords, we're in the market to rent out properties to make money. It doesn't make sense to go through this whole process unless there is a reason. But because no reason is given, there isn't the ability for the tenant to say, I don't agree, this, that, the other, this now has to go to court, this now has to be heard by a judge. It's a process that actually works quite well. The whole process takes 6 months, which does give people a fair amount of time to work out where they might be moving to. It's not the first part of the process, the 2 months notice, that is really important. It's the full process, which takes 6 months. One thing that could have been done was what was done during COVID, which didn't require any primary or secondary legislation. The government just said, we need to protect tenants. We're changing the notice period at the front end to 4 months, or we're changing the notice period at the front end to 3 months. So then the process becomes a 7 or an 8 month process. Still the same process. But there's now more security to the tenant that they can think about moving on. If the relationship with their landlord has broken down, it's not going to get repaired, really, once it's broken down. And so there isn't really going to be a solution to that relationship. Perhaps it is best sometimes for tenants just to find somewhere else to move to. So that's the case for landlords. But I feel it's much like insurance. Now, I drive a car because I can get insurance. And if I crash into someone or someone crashes into me, the insurer will pay out $1 million, $2 million, $5 million. I don't have 1, 2, 5 million in cash sitting in the bank account. If we had no insurance, I wouldn't drive a car because I wouldn't want the risk of that liability. And taking away a mechanism whereby landlords can get their properties back if there's a good reason that they want to get the property back, but they want a process that doesn't have to go into a clogged up court system, that is taking away the insurance policy. And so all it means is those who are more vulnerable in society, those who pay rent at a low level, those who are lower income, those who are getting local housing allowance, landlords will want to take less of a chance on them because they haven't got this insurance policy of getting the property back. So again, you're looking for a tenant-friendly policy, but the mechanism that is being removed to make it more friendly to tenants is actually making it less friendly to the most vulnerable tenants in society.
Yeah, I agree with that these vulnerable tenants, because I've been able to make decisions and I'm going, well, if things don't work out, there are ways and means for me to actually move someone on because something bad has happened or I can't let to this person anymore. Not that I want to, but I was happy to take them on when other landlords wouldn't take them on because I understood the risks, as you're saying. And I think that's going to disappear. And therefore, people aren't going to want to take the risk and take them on. Yep. And therefore, they're really going to struggle. And the council is going to really have to step up and start to look after these vulnerable people. And really what's going to happen is landlords are expected to take care of these vulnerable people. And a lot of landlords do take care of some of these vulnerable people rather than the council. And the council are always trying to hand them over to landlords to look after and house and everything. And what's going to happen is the council are going to have that responsibility. And the budgets in the council are going to have to go through the roof to house all these people that are going to struggle to get into housing. And it's all very well and good as well, because there's always this a landlord can't advertise a property and say no universal credit and all of this lot. But there's a credit check that a landlord can put someone through. So you might not be able to advertise no universal credit, but they just go, well, these are my rules on affordability. There's no rule against that. And sorry, your income doesn't match it. So I do think that it's unfortunately, again, there's going to be some big issues to the housing market when that happens. And I also think as someone in property, I look at all of the parties and I think actually there's no landlord, traditionally the Conservatives I felt were far more friendly towards landlords than the other parties. And now, the Conservatives are the one who's, took a section, the interest, section 24, isn't it? Implemented that. So I'm thinking, they've not been great for landlords. And that concerns me over Labour coming in and what they'll do.
The whole economics of the industry has changed. There used to be 1.8 million landlords, and those 1.8 million landlords, 93% of them only had one property. And there's just the view of the government that if you've got a property in your personal name that you're renting, you're not declaring the income. That's their view. And so the solution is to force these people out of the market. We'll bring in stamp duty increases, Section 24, a pretty hostile environment, and they'll end up basically being forced to sell. And then the people who enter the market will be these big pension funds and companies who are really robust, and we've got visibility. We can tax them on a quarterly basis. We can see what's going on. All that's happening is people are just setting up a company for 12 quid and doing the same thing. So it's not really changing this. I mean, I would say some people are just exiting the market.
I think there have been
driving
people,
up the demand. Yeah.
I think landlords have exited. I mean, I personally feel landlords have exited. I think there's always landlords exiting, but I think there is a particularly larger amount at the moment exiting because they look at the future and go. But that's what happens in life, isn't it? I do think that's what happens in life. We mustn't lose sight of that. Is that I think every generation goes through and says, "Oh, it's a lot harder than when I was, back in the day. It's always a lot harder." But that's life. It's always like that. So the landlords who were in the 70s, in the 80s, it was a lot easier. In the 90s, it was, each time, because more legislation comes in, because more competition comes in, because all of this stuff. So, you do have to run your portfolio as a business, as a commercially profitable enterprise, and be ready to adapt. And I think, you are having to professionalise as a landlord because, the legislation, if you don't know what you're doing, having just the one property is a hell of a lot of knowledge that you've got to suck up to keep yourself on top of the case. So I do think, these these people with maybe one other property, two other properties, I think there's going to be less of those. And I think it's the more serious portfolio landlord who are going to stick around, be here, and it'll be interesting to see whether the corporates, the whole build to rent sector is a sector that the different, all governments, I think, want to encourage. So, us smaller type landlords, I think, are going to have to react accordingly moving forwards. And I think that's what's driven, again, a huge popularity in HMOs and things like that, because we need more profit to make all of this work and to have the money to be able to adapt and do all of these things. So I think that's why a lot of investors do like HMOs, etc., etc. One thing I also wanted to pick up on is obviously, I'm not a huge, I haven't read too much about every single housing policy of the different parties, but one of the things I think the Liberal Democrats are also suggesting. I think everyone's just suggesting crazy policies all over the place to hit the headlines.
I think so let's zoom out a bit. If you want to make a substantive change to the marketplace for housing, everyone knows there's an imbalance of supply and demand.
Yeah.
There are some drivers. We have more population because the population is growing. We've got more migration to the country than we had 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Not necessarily bad migration. Some of the sort of people that we want in the country.
We've just got a growing population.
You've got more divorcees. You've got the nuclear family's broken down, and people live in smaller units. So you used to have extended families in one house. Now it's broken down. We've also got people who want greater flexibility for jobs. We've got the millennials, and they don't necessarily want to buy a house and be fixed in one place. They want the flexibility of renting everything and being able to go to different opportunities at different times in different geographies. So all these things are creating a higher demand for housing, and specifically smaller unit sizes. And the solution is, one, more HMOs will help, higher quality HMOs. But two, we just need more housing. And when you start to look at the planning place, the two parties are just basically the same. And really, it's more of a sort of generational view. So back in the 1950s, we used to have zoning. So you'd have the town centre, only commercial, the suburbs around the town centre, no residential in the towns. Then that shifted, then it shifted back, and now it's shifting back again to the 1950s. It's just the pendulum.
Yeah.
Now the government, both parties, they realise the high street is not dying, it's just changing. It's changing to an internet-proof place where there are services there that you just can't buy on Amazon. So it's more healthcare, experiential,
service orientated.
And the only way to breathe life into the town centre is to put life into the town centre. So it doesn't make sense anymore having this zoning. It makes much more sense to have people living in town centres above the retail units. So that's why there's all these permitted development rights. That's why it's government policy to convert underutilised upper stories in the town centre to residential. And Labour ain't going to change that either. So that's already there. And there's been a lot of tinkering around permitted developments because the government, and I think Labour are the same, don't trust the local authority, don't trust the local planning community. And they want to take away controls from them because they see them as blocking approving applications. And what happens, again, it's the deflated balloon thing. If you have someone who has been trained in a profession and you start taking away their control and you leave them with less control, the bit they've got left, they get like hypersensitive about. So whereas before they would have approved a plan, now they're going to go, no, this is the only thing I control. I only have power by saying no, so I'm going to say no. So again, the deflated balloon, things that would have been approved before, full planning applications that would have got approved before, now are getting rejected. And it's because these professional people have less control, their world's got smaller and they can only say yes or no over less things. So therefore they're going to say, they've got less applications they can say no to, so they're going to say no proportionally more on what comes to them. So again, unintended consequences. But the planning law you can't just change with one policy idea. If something is a material change of use, it needs planning permission. You can bring in permitted developments to tinker, but going from one unit to multiple units, that requires a planning application. There's been a lot of talk about, we'll take houses and we'll make them into 2 flats and we'll make it permitted development. It is really a material change of use because it's a real intensification of what was there before. But in order for it to be permitted development, there has to be one standard for everywhere in the country. And therefore, there's so many different rules and boxes you've got to tick. It's actually just easier to do a planning application, say, well, this would work best. And if you don't give it to me, I'll do the permitted development rights. So these things aren't easy things to change.
And I don't think any party is coming up with a solution for this because I do think the planning system is archaic. It's still very locally orientated and it needs to be more centrally led. I know the permitted development's supposed to sort of drive some of these policies into the local communities, and to a degree some of that office to resi conversion has worked and been successful. I guess that's a scale. All of these other things I think are small scale. They're drop in the ocean of the demand of housing that they need.
Yeah.
They need to build enormous amounts of policy. I think again, making these councils accountable for hitting targets and things like that, I think is something that needs to be done. And again, there are certain councils are out there. There are in in jeopardy. But how much jeopardy do they get into? What is the punishment for not actually meeting their planning requirements? And can we up those or something? I mean, how do we get more houses built in this country? Because it is what the country needs. It is what people want. And I don't think any of the parties has got a solution for that. So I think in some ways, as a property investor who's holding for the long term, that's quite good because they're just going to continue to drive up prices in the longer term. And, it's going to be interesting. Do you think, the current, the 20-year-olds, some want to buy houses, but there's a lot that don't. And I think a lot of people are going to be quite happy not. It ties up a lot of money. There's a lot more mobility that people want.
I think we're moving to a European model.
Yeah.
20 years ago, the aspiration of everybody was to own their own home. I don't think that's the case anymore. There's a number of reasons for that, but partially just the increase in real estate prices, the amount of deposit people need.
Yes.
It just now makes it no longer a realistic aspiration. So people don't even bother dreaming it. They just don't expect it to ever happen. But it's not a bad thing. I mean, you've got Germany, you've got France, you've got the Nordics. People are okay renting.
I think it's just been ingrained into the British society, hasn't it? Because there was a generation, I guess, the baby boomers, who made an awful lot of money by owning their own properties, and of course told all of their children to own their own properties. And a lot of those children did own have owned a lot of their own properties, so thinking they should tell their children to own properties as well. And obviously then there was also Maggie Thatcher with the whole council house buying and all of that lot, which drove ownership, and that was a Conservative policy at the time, which drove wealth into the nation, but also drove ownership into the nation.
And removed stock from the council.
But that was the big issue. And I was like, I don't understand that. I was quite young at the time, I guess, but I didn't understand it. And the idea was that the money would be paid to replenish stock, which it never has. And I think that is the biggest thing, is the council stock went down during that period and they've never replenished it, so there isn't enough council stock for affordable housing.
It's very simple. There's two solutions. You either partner with the private rental sector and have more friendly policies for the private rental sector to bring in its capital and expand, or you don't, which is kind of where we are. There's legislation that is pretty much anti the private rental sector. But then if you don't do it, you need to start buying and building your own stock, which neither party are
that's the issue, isn't it? And Maggie Thatcher was the property sector as we know it. She was the birth of it, really, because she kind of got the buy-to-let mortgage with the section. I think she was the one introducing the Section 21 that enabled the banks to lend on with buy-to-let products, as opposed to, it was really difficult to get lending prior to that because banks were scared about getting possession and lifetime tenancies and all of that. She opened up access for people to become landlords as well as own their own properties, and that's the buy-to-let sector took off. So as the council, the private sector stepped in, which was a whole move that, Conservatives made of, privatising elements of the whole country. And but more stock has never been built, and that's the problem. And I think we need to just build more stock quickly to address this housing issue. But who knows whether
I think
today.
One of the big issues is that you've got a Conservative Party with Rishi Sunak. It's not really clear what he wants.
No,
because we don't have many conviction politicians anymore in politics. You've got Starmer, who is a very safe pair of hands. But he's also struggling to say what he actually believes in. Safe pair of hands, but what's his vision? Because he's not the policy maker. The policies are coming from the Rachel Reeves and the other people behind him. So you've got two people, you're not really sure what they believe in. And it's helpful in politics to have something you believe in, something worthy that's significant, that you want to put your all into getting done in your 5 years, because it helps guide everything else. And without that, you end up in sort of what we've seen with the Donald Trump model, which is don't believe anything, or the Boris Johnson, don't really believe in anything. Let's just make a decision day to day that seems like a good decision. And I remember
populist decision. What the opinion polls say. Let's go to the polls, see if this decision is a winner or this one, and we'll go with that one. Not like it's more about doing market research, responding to the polls, rather than, as you say, this is my philosophy, this is how I think it's going to drive the country forward. And I think all parties lack a vision. None of them have a vision.
And that vision is a coordinated vision that actually encompasses lots of other things. It's not just one
And that's
headline.
why all the parties are infighting. There's different segments because they all have different things that they believe in. None of them are united behind the core principles that they're fighting for. You don't know what they are. Starmer has taken the approach of I'm not going to say anything because the less I say, the more popular I'm going to become, because we're just going to let the Conservatives continue to fuck it up. And Lib Dems are so, you hardly know who they are anymore, that they're not really going to make a real crushing effect on Labour. So for me, Labour are going to storm it. I think we're going to see devastation of the Conservatives. So I guess, how is that going to affect you? So if that's the case, and we'll find out soon, won't we? What do you think the impact is going to be?
Well, I would say a couple of things.
As a property investor,
I'd say a couple of things. I think the Section 21 alternative is going to be harsher than what we had. So, but what I'd also say is we bought a bit of time because the Section 21 thing has disappeared.
Yep.
There's now a bit of time. So there's time for landlords to get their housekeeping in order. And the first thing you should do, if there's potential reduction in control over how you manage an asset and your tenancies and potential rent controls, is you need to make sure you've got the right tenants in now, and you need to make sure that those tenants are paying market rates, because it may become very hard or impossible to increase your rent to market rate if it isn't already market rent.
Yeah.
If there's a rent control, you can only go up 3.5% a year, and you're 20% below market rate. You're never going to be able to catch up, and the tenant is never going to leave because you're paying them or you're subsidising for them to stay in the property. So I think there is this period of time where we've still got Section 21, we've still got all the legislation that we've had for years, and this is the time where landlords who tend to be quite lazy should be looking at each of their properties and going, right, do I have the right tenants? Is this someone that I want potentially for the next 10, 20 years? And are they paying the market rent? And if not, what can I do to get to that point?
So the key thing, when you're a landlord, if Labour have got in, first thing you should be doing is getting your house in order. So get rid of tenants you don't want. Unfortunately, those that are on the borderline, maybe you are having to, which sounds harsh, but this is a business and you've got to, understand that, but also put your rents up. So again, you're talking about sort of unnecessary consequences. Just even the talk of it is forcing people's rents up because people are going to get there as high as they can, and then so put that up. But also for me as well, I think one of the other things is I'm looking like, okay, which parts of this are going to remain profitable? It's not all bad. Long-term tenants aren't all bad because, as I said earlier, potentially your maintenance goes down. Having a property constantly occupied is continually bringing in rent. And if you've got switchovers, that is costly.
So long as you're getting market rents. I'm not saying go above market rent. I'm just saying review where market rent is and
but
move
what
your
I'm
rent
saying
up
is
towards
actually, there are some tenancies that I didn't put up for a very long time because people moved in, they didn't say anything, they never caused any problems, and I just left their rent. And actually, they were relatively profitable because there was nothing that I needed to spend on it. There was no time I needed to spend on it. And they were looking after them like their houses and homes. And actually, because I wasn't refinancing and because I wasn't doing anything.
The difference was you could choose at any point to put the rent up.
Absolutely.
And the deflated balloon law says that when that right is taken away from you, when you know that right's going to be taken away from you, it forces you to put up rents that you otherwise would have just
absolutely,
left.
Because there are certain tenants who I've had to look at, rents have gone up, and you don't want to be stuck down here when rents have gone up here. So unfortunately, where, as you say, that rents could have stayed where they are, rents now, a lot of landlords will be going, I have to put it up because I don't want to be stuck down here and be stuck here forever, because if something does happen or the market happens, Section 21 or something that hits my costs, I've got to put the rent up. So there are things that are driving the rents up and doing that. So I think that's the case. I think, as I said, Liberal Democrats, you don't really hear too much about their policy. The only policy that I am aware of that they've talked about is scrapping rates, because obviously rates are, there is a big thing around rates at the moment because they're saying it's killing the high street, properties. It's unfair. You've got these warehouses of Amazon and they're not paying the same rates as we are. And we've got cost of business and everybody can compete online and we're killing the high street. So they've come up with scrapping the rates or transferring that to the landlord, which wouldn't work either. And again, that's a knock-on effect that they're not understanding. And as usual with politicians, they talk a good game, but they never say how they're going to pay for that. And it brings in a lot of money. What's your views on that kind of view of the policy?
Well, the problem with business rates, it brings in money. And if you get rid of it, you need to find the money from somewhere else. It's not particularly fair, but it is a system that's been there for a long period of time. Most commercial tenancies have been there for a long period of time. People are used to those rates. They only move up, they don't suddenly jump up by 20%. They get rebanded and they move up gradually. So people can kind of cope with them. Yes, it's perhaps unfair that internet businesses don't pay any rates at all, but I don't think you necessarily solve the problem by getting rid of business rates and then coming up with something else, which you're not able to articulate what it is. So the real thing about business rates is, what I find, the local authority doesn't care about who pays the business rates, so long as they get paid the business rates. So there's small business rates relief, and what that means is the central government has to give the local authority the money. So if you've got lots of smaller units, then the high street's more vital. You're saving a big cost for small and medium enterprises to get in. They're just paying the rent. They're not paying up to an equivalent amount of money on rates. So it's good for them. So I think the actual solution is subdivision of bigger units in town centres to smaller units. And a lot of the growth does come from the Mart and Par type businesses. I think there should be more of them. I think the town centre needs to shrink, so we have less commercial, but focused in the town centre, and that commercial is all around service industries. People having their nails done, haircuts, restaurants, things that you can't have delivered by Amazon. Exactly. So I don't think the high street's dying. I think the high street's just changing, and you just have to accept it's changing. You can't fight the change. You just need to go with it. And so even within the existing system, there is a way to make the high street much more vital and work better for smaller entities.
I think for me, the high street and where everyone should be heading and what council should be doing is promoting community in the high street, communities. That's where, having service-based businesses connects people again. I think, with COVID, we've lost a lot of that connection. We've lost a lot of that community feel. It was there for a period of time in COVID because people were pulling together. It's like, get that back in the high street, get the old-fashioned high street where people used to wander up and down, buy their groceries, know everybody, get that community back. Coffee shops are great. Beauty salons are great because everyone natters in there, don't they? Barbers, maybe us men just sit there and don't say too much, but really we should be opening up. That's where they say that happens on the barber's chair as well. So I think bring back communities and really try and stimulate that. And anything you can do to stimulate businesses back in there, I think is good for the economy. We're moving slightly off housing at this point and property things, but I think a couple of things that I certainly will be thinking about is the sectors of property that I invest moving forwards might vary depending on the outcome of the election. And for you, what's your thinking about what you might do differently?
Just the discipline to look at when the tenancy started, when is the annual points. 2 months before then, checking out what is the market rate. Am I massively under market rate or am I slightly under market rate? And just making sure that I'm keeping up with where the market is. I think that's really important because that kind of insulates me from whatever policies are made down the line.
I think also, I think that there's also been some strategic moves you made in your business that is actually switching the sectors that kind of you're operating in.
I've switched out of...
You're moving away from the traditional AST into other sectors, into, and I think, although certainly, the whole rental sector is not dead at all and you can still make good money, I think there's other areas that are looking very attractive as an investment source that may be a bit more attractive than the traditional buy-to-let sector now. Yeah. And I think, just to close this up, I think we'll leave that thought with the viewers as to, have a look at the whole property market. And everyone, I think, is very blinkered onto the residential AST type market, yet, and also Airbnb's taken off, hasn't it? But there are certain sectors that actually could be quite attractive out there and actually do very well for you. So I don't think it's all doom and gloom out there. So don't get too stressed. Just know that you can take your business in different directions. And that would be my closing word.
Absolutely, I totally agree with that, Mike.
And we finish there. I don't know what to say. So there we go.
Good.